The night shift at the Cornerpoint gas station was always quiet, and Jake Walker preferred it that way. The solitude gave him time to think, to reset. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of passing cars, and the occasional customer were his only companions during those long hours. That night started like any other. Jake was restocking shelves and wiping down counters when he noticed a beat-up old truck pull into the lot. The engine sputtered loudly as it came to a stop at Pump 2. The truck looked like it had survived more decades than it should have, and the driver didn't seem much different. Jake watched through the window as the man stepped out. He was elderly, wearing a worn jacket and boots patched with duct tape. His movements were slow, almost hesitant, as he pulled out a thin wallet and slid a card into the pump. Jake knew the routine before it even played out. Seconds later, the pump screen flashed a red error message. The man tried again, his shoulders sagging a little lower each time the card was declined. Jake stood frozen for a moment, torn between the rules drilled into him by his manager and his own instincts. The man didn't just look tired. He looked defeated, the kind of exhaustion that went far beyond a bad day. Jake couldn't just stand there. Without overthinking, he stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold as he walked over to the pump. The man glanced at him briefly, his face lined with years of hard living. Jake didn't ask questions or wait for explanations. He walked back to the register, activated the pump, and rang up $20 of gas on the station's account. It wasn't much, but it would get the man where he needed to go. From the corner of his eye, Jake saw the man give a faint nod of gratitude before filling up his tank. Jake didn't wait around for thanks. He returned to the counter and resumed stocking shelves, pushing the moment out of his mind. By the time the man drove off, Jake felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He knew what he'd done was against company policy, but how could anyone stand by and watch someone struggle like that? To Jake, it wasn't just about the gas, it was about dignity, about showing someone that they weren't invisible. But not everyone saw it that way. Later that night, as Jake was organizing the cooler, the front door slammed open. Bryce Thompson, the station manager, stormed in, his face flushed with anger. Bryce was the kind of boss who thrived on authority, always looking for reasons to assert control. Jake barely had time to process the situation before Bryce launched into him. The scolding was loud and relentless. Jake tried to explain, but Bryce wasn't interested. Policy had been broken, and that was all that mattered to him. Jake's explanation, his quiet reasoning that a small act of kindness shouldn't cost him his job, was met with cold indifference. Bryce made his decision on the spot. Fired. Jake handed over his badge and keys without a word. His face burned with frustration, but he refused to give Bryce the satisfaction of an argument. There was no reasoning with someone like that. The walk home felt longer than usual. Jake replayed the events of the night in his head, wondering if he should have just let it go, followed the rules and kept his job. But no matter how many ways he looked at it, he couldn't bring himself to regret what he'd done. When he got home, the emptiness of his apartment felt heavier than usual. He dropped his keys on the counter, collapsed onto the couch, and stared at the ceiling. He needed that job, needed the paycheck to cover rent and groceries, but what stung more than the loss was the injustice of it all. He'd done the right thing, and yet he was the one paying the price. The hours ticked by slowly. Jake eventually drifted off to sleep on the couch, the events of the night still weighing on him like a heavy fog. Morning came with an unexpected knock at the door. It was sharp, deliberate, and completely out of place in Jake's otherwise quiet morning. Still groggy, he rubbed his eyes and shuffled to the door, wondering who it could be. When he opened it, he froze. Standing there was the old man from the gas station. But this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a tall, well-dressed man with a leather briefcase, his suit impeccably tailored and his expression unreadable. Jake's first thought was confusion, quickly followed by suspicion. He had no idea why they were there or how they'd found him, but there was something in the old man's eyes that stopped Jake from saying anything. The man stepped forward slightly, his gaze steady, and extended a hand toward Jake. It wasn't the look of someone coming to offer simple gratitude. It was the look of someone about to change everything. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the two figures on his doorstep. The old man from the gas station looked calmer now, his weathered face softened by something Jake couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Maybe, or determination. Beside him, the man in the sharp suit looked completely out of place, his polished shoes gleaming against the cracked concrete of Jake's apartment walkway. The old man didn't say anything at first. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and handed Jake a folded piece of paper. Jake hesitated before taking it, his mind racing. The paper was thick, heavier than anything casual, with an elegant letterhead embossed at the top. Jake unfolded it, his eyes scanning the text. It wasn't a letter of thanks. It wasn't even a receipt. It was a contract. He read it again, slower this time, trying to make sense of the words. Something about a fund, a property, a sum of money that made Jake's stomach flip. He glanced back at the man in the suit, who stepped forward with a brief nod. The suited man explained, not with words, but with a gesture, pointing toward the bottom of the contract where a figure was listed. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw the number. It was more than he'd ever made in a year, more than he'd ever imagined holding in his lifetime. The old man finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. The few words he offered explained everything. The gas station incident hadn't just been a random act of kindness. It had been a test. The man, whose name was Charles Finch, wasn't just some poor old guy down on his luck. He was the owner of Finch Enterprises, a name Jake vaguely recognized from news headlines about a wealthy industrialist who had donated millions to community projects over the years. Charles had spent years quietly finding ways to identify people who went out of their way to help others, without expecting anything in return. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. His act of kindness, something so small, so instinctive, had set off a chain of events he couldn't have predicted. Charles explained that the contract was part of a program he ran. The figure at the bottom wasn't just a random amount. It was a grant. A way to give people like Jake a chance to pursue something bigger than a dead-end job. The money wasn't a loan, nor was it charity. It was an investment in Jake's potential. The man in the suit handed Jake a second document, a more detailed explanation of what the grant could be used for. Business ventures, education, personal development. The opportunities were endless, as long as Jake used the funds with the same sense of purpose that had led him to help Charles in the first place. Jake didn't know what to say. His thoughts were a mess of disbelief and awe. Just a day ago, he'd lost his job for doing what he thought was right, and now here he was, holding the opportunity of a lifetime in his hands. Charles watched him closely, his expression steady but kind. There was no pressure, no demand for a decision on the spot. He simply gave Jake a small nod, as if to say, "The choice is yours." After what felt like an eternity, Jake nodded. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to waste this chance. Charles left with the suited man, the quiet of the morning returning as Jake stood in the doorway, clutching the contract like it was the key to a new life. For the rest of the day, Jake couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He reread the documents over and over, his mind buzzing with possibilities. What would he do with the money? Go back to school? Start a business? The idea of taking control of his life for the first time filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. As the sun set that evening, Jake sat on his couch, staring out the window at the city lights. He didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose. The act of kindness that had cost him everything was now giving him a future he never thought possible. And as he closed his eyes that night, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, losing his job had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. The first few days after Charles Finch's visit were surreal for Jake. He read the contract a dozen times, afraid that it might vanish if he didn't commit every word to memory. The amount of money listed was staggering, but it wasn't just the money that got to him, it was the opportunity. For years, Jake's life had been defined by surviving, not thriving. His childhood in a struggling neighborhood had taught him how to stretch a dollar and expect nothing more than the bare minimum. The idea of being handed a chance to build something better felt almost impossible to grasp. First, he didn't tell anyone. Not his friends, not his landlord, not even his sister, who called once a week to check on him. He wasn't ready to explain, wasn't even sure he could put it into words yet. Instead, Jake spent hours sitting at his kitchen table, making lists of ideas. Should he go back to school? Maybe study business or engineering? Or should he start something of his own? A small shop, a service that could help people like him? The possibilities were overwhelming, but for the first time in his life, Jake wasn't scared of them. The only thing that lingered in his mind was Bryce, his former manager. Losing the job still stung, even though it had led to this unexpected twist. Part of Jake wanted to march back into the gas station and show Bryce the contract, prove to him that doing the right thing wasn't a weakness. But another part of him knew it didn't matter anymore. Bryce's opinion was irrelevant now. Jake's focus was on the future. A week after the visit, Jake got a call from the man who had been with Charles that morning. His name was Simon Brooks, and he introduced himself as one of the coordinators for the Finch program. Simon explained that the next step was for Jake to meet with a financial advisor who would help him structure the grant. Jake was nervous as he walked into the sleek downtown office for the meeting. The room smelled like polished wood and fresh coffee, and everyone was dressed like they belonged on the cover of a magazine. Jake felt out of place in his thrift store button-up, but Simon greeted him warmly and walked him through the process. Over the next 2 hours, Jake laid out his initial ideas while the advisor took notes. He explained how he wanted to use the money, not just for himself but to create something that could benefit others. It was a vague plan, but Simon didn't rush him. Instead, he offered practical advice, suggesting ways to refine his goals and make the most of the grant. By the end of the meeting, Jake felt lighter. He had a clearer picture of what he wanted to do, and for the first time he felt like he could actually pull it off. In the following weeks, Jake threw himself into his plans. He spent hours at the library, researching small businesses and community projects. He reached out to old friends for advice and even sat in on free workshops about entrepreneurship. Every day felt like a step forward, a chance to prove to himself, and maybe even to Charles, that he was worthy of the opportunity he'd been given. But it wasn't just the work that changed Jake. The more he planned, the more he started to believe in himself. He no longer felt like the guy who'd been stuck behind a gas station counter, waiting for life to happen to him. Now he was taking control. One day, as Jake was walking home from a meeting, he passed by the Corner Point station. He hadn't been there since the night he'd been fired, and seeing it again brought a flood of memories. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and Bryce's car was parked out front, just as it always was. Jake stood across the street, staring at the place that had been his entire world not so long ago. He thought about going inside, about telling Bryce what had happened since he'd left. But as he stood there, he realized something important. He didn't need to. Bryce's world was still the same, small, rigid, defined by rules that left no room for compassion. Jake's world, on the other hand, had expanded in ways he never thought possible. And for the first time, he felt at peace with the way things had unfolded. Jake turned and walked away, his head held high. Months later, Jake stood in the middle of a small, brightly lit storefront. The sign above the door read Walker's Community Goods, and inside, shelves were lined with affordable essentials for families who needed them most. The shop wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline, offering discounted groceries, school supplies, and even a small corner where kids could sit and read books while their parents shopped. Opening the store had been a whirlwind. Jake had poured every ounce of energy into it, working long hours and leaning on the guidance of Simon and the financial advisors from Finch's program. The grant had covered the initial setup, but Jake's determination had carried it forward. On the day of the grand opening, a steady stream of customers came through the doors, each one greeted by Jake's warm smile. Parents thanked him quietly as their children raced to the book corner, their laughter filling the air. As Jake watched the scene unfold, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he'd wanted, to create something that made a difference, something rooted in the same kind of kindness he'd shown to Charles that night at the gas station. In the corner of the shop, Jake spotted a familiar figure. Charles Finch stood quietly, watching the customers with a faint smile. He didn't draw attention to himself, didn't demand recognition. When their eyes met, Jake nodded in gratitude, and Charles returned the gesture before slipping out the door. Jake stood there for a moment, taking it all in. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined, all because of a small act of kindness. As he turned back to greet the next customer, Jake realized that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to build one step at a time. The days after the grand opening of Walker's Community Goods were a blur of activity. Customers came in steadily, many of them surprised to find a store that prioritized helping over profit. Jake stayed busy, stocking shelves, organizing donations, and listening to the stories of the people who came through his doors. Each interaction reminded him of why he'd started this journey. The single mom who thanked him for the affordable school supplies, the elderly man who lingered by the free book corner to read to his granddaughter, the teenager who nervously asked if there were any part-time jobs available. Every smile, every word of gratitude, filled Jake with a sense of purpose he'd never known before. But the work wasn't easy. Running the store demanded long hours and constant problem-solving. The grant had given him a strong start, but Jake knew he'd need to keep growing the business if he wanted it to be sustainable. Donations were critical, and he spent many late nights drafting letters to local businesses and community organizations, hoping they'd be willing to help. Despite the challenges, Jake felt alive. For the first time, he wasn't just scraping by, he was building something meaningful. A month after the opening, Jake received an unexpected invitation. A formal letter arrived in the mail, embossed with the Finch Enterprises logo. It was an invitation to a private dinner hosted by Charles Finch himself. Jake didn't hesitate. He wanted to thank Charles in person, not just for the financial support but for believing in him when no one else had. The dinner was held at an upscale restaurant in the city. Jake felt out of place as he stepped into the elegant dining room, surrounded by polished wood and chandeliers. The guests were a mix of professionals, philanthropists, and a few other grant recipients like him. When Charles approached, Jake stood to shake his hand, but the older man waved him off and pulled him into a brief, firm hug instead. Charles's presence was as steady as ever, his sharp eyes scanning Jake's face with a quiet satisfaction. As the dinner progressed, Jake listened to the stories of the other guests. People from different walks of life, each of them changed by the opportunities Charles had given them. Some had started businesses, others had pursued education or launched charitable initiatives. It was humbling to be part of such a diverse and driven group. When it was Jake's turn to speak, he stood and cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the room's attention. He spoke honestly, describing how the grant had transformed his life and allowed him to build a business that supported the community. He talked about Tyler, the boy who loved the book corner, and Margaret, the widow who came every week to buy supplies for her church. As he finished, Charles raised his glass in a quiet toast, his eyes shining with approval. The next day, Jake returned to the store feeling more motivated than ever. The connections he'd made at the dinner opened new doors. Local businesses began donating goods, and a charity organization reached out to partner with him for future events. But the biggest surprise came 2 weeks later. Jake was in the middle of organizing a food drive when a familiar figure walked through the door. Bryce. Jake froze, his hands full of canned goods, as his former manager stepped into the store. Bryce looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room like he wasn't sure he belonged there. Jake approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Bryce cleared his throat, his face red with awkwardness. He explained that the gas station had fallen on hard times. Profits were down and management was cutting hours. Bryce had been let go. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions as he listened. Part of him wanted to remind Bryce of the night he'd been fired, to point out the irony of their reversed fortunes. But as he looked at the man who had once been so smug and dismissive, Jake saw something different: humility. Bryce admitted that he'd heard about the store through mutual acquaintances. He'd come to ask if Jake had any job openings. For a moment, Jake considered turning him away. It would have been easy to say no, to hold onto the bitterness he'd carried since that night. But as he glanced around the store, at the shelves stocked with donated goods and the customers who relied on this place, he realized something important. The store wasn't just about helping others, it was about second chances. Jake nodded and told Bryce to come back the next day to fill out some paperwork. The weeks that followed brought even more growth for Walker's Community Goods. The food drive was a success. The partnerships with local businesses flourished, and Bryce, to Jake's surprise, turned out to be a hard worker when given the chance. One evening, as Jake was locking up the store, he noticed an envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a handwritten note from a customer, thanking him for creating a place where people could find help without judgment. Jake smiled, slipping the note into his pocket. The store had become more than he'd ever imagined, but the impact it had on the community was what mattered most. As he walked home under the glow of the streetlights, Jake thought back to that night at the gas station. The moment he'd paid for a stranger's gas without expecting anything in return. It had cost him his job, but it had also given him a new life, one filled with purpose, connection, and hope. Kindness had been his beginning, and it was the foundation of everything he'd built. Months after opening Walker's Community Goods, Jake Walker stood behind the counter, watching the steady stream of customers move through the store. Parents picked out groceries while their children gathered in the book corner, their laughter rising above the soft hum of conversation. Shelves were stocked, the lights were warm, and the store had become a second home to so many people in the neighborhood. Jake never imagined his life could look like this. The store wasn't just a place to buy essentials. It was a lifeline, a beacon for people who felt forgotten. Every day, someone new walked through the door with a story of struggle or hardship, and Jake did what he could to help. The store had grown beyond what he'd ever dreamed. Local businesses and nonprofits now partnered with him regularly. They donated goods, sponsored food drives, and even hosted events in the small space. Jake had turned a simple idea into a thriving community hub, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. But the journey hadn't been easy. Jake thought often about the night Charles Finch had knocked on his door. The moment had felt unreal, like a twist of fate he couldn't have seen coming. What had started as a small act of kindness, paying for an elderly man's gas, had turned his life upside down. Losing his job at the gas station had felt like the end of the world at the time. But now, standing in his store surrounded by people who relied on it, Jake understood that it had been the beginning of everything. The days passed quickly, and Jake rarely had time to think about how far he'd come. He was too busy running the store, balancing inventory, and organizing donation programs. But every now and then, a moment would stop him in his tracks and remind him why he'd started this journey. One snowy evening in December, as Jake was preparing to close up, a familiar face walked through the door. It was Bryce, his former manager at the gas station. Jake hadn't seen Bryce in months, not since he'd reluctantly hired him as a part-time employee after the man lost his job. Bryce had been humbled by his fall from grace, but he'd worked hard in the store, stocking shelves and helping customers without complaint. Over time, the tension between them had faded, replaced by something closer to mutual respect. That evening, Bryce approached Jake with a hesitant expression. He handed over a folded piece of paper and muttered something about a letter of resignation. Jake unfolded the paper and read it, realizing that Bryce had been offered a job at a larger retail chain. A management position, no less. Bryce didn't say much, but his tone was sincere as he thanked Jake for giving him a second chance when no one else would. Jake shook his hand, telling him he'd earned it, and watched as Bryce walked out into the snow, a changed man. It was a small moment, but it stayed with Jake. It reminded him that the store wasn't just about helping customers. It was about rebuilding lives, including those he never thought he'd help. A few weeks later, another moment brought Jake's journey into sharp focus. The day was cold and gray, with a thin drizzle coating the streets. Jake was busy helping a mother of 3 pack groceries when the bell above the door jingled. He turned and saw a young boy walk in, no older than 10, with a torn jacket and oversized shoes. He clutched a small envelope in his hands and approached Jake timidly. Jake knelt down to the boy's level, smiling to put him at ease. The boy handed him the envelope without a word. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a handful of crumpled dollar bills. The note was written in shaky pencil, and Jake's throat tightened as he read it. "Thank you for the food and books. My mom says we wouldn't have made it without you. Please use this money to help someone else, like you helped us." Jake glanced at the boy, who was looking at him with a mixture of pride and shyness. He wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached out and ruffled the boy's hair before slipping the envelope into his pocket. After the boy left, Jake sat behind the counter, holding the note like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever received. It wasn't the first thank you he'd gotten, but something about it felt different. It reminded him of the ripple effect of kindness, how one small act could spread far beyond what anyone imagined. Months turned into a year, and Walker's Community Goods continued to grow. Jake expanded the store, adding a small kitchen where volunteers prepared free meals for families on weekends. A local mechanic offered discounted car repairs through a partnership with the store, and a retired teacher started weekly literacy classes for children. Jake's days were long, but he didn't mind. He found joy in the small moments, seeing a child learn to read, watching a mother leave with a full bag of groceries and a smile on her face, hearing laughter fill the store during an evening tutoring session. He also found himself thinking more about Charles Finch. The old man hadn't visited the store again, but Jake often thought about the way he'd appeared that morning on Jake's doorstep, carrying not just an opportunity but a challenge. Charles had believed in him when no one else had, and Jake had spent every day since trying to prove that belief wasn't misplaced. One afternoon, as Jake was stocking shelves, he heard the familiar jingle of the doorbell. He turned and froze. Charles stood near the entrance, his posture steady but his face lined with age. He looked around the store, taking in the shelves, the book corner, the busy customers. When his eyes met Jake's, he gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Jake walked over, shaking Charles's hand firmly. The older man said little, but his presence spoke volumes. He stayed for an hour, quietly observing, before slipping out as discreetly as he had come. That evening, Jake found a handwritten note taped to the register. It was from Charles. "Kindness is the greatest investment. Keep building. Keep believing. You've proven that it works." Jake stared at the note for a long time, his chest tight with emotion. That night, as Jake locked up the store, he paused outside and looked up at the sign. The simple words "Walker's Community Goods" glowed softly in the dark, a reminder of how far he'd come. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, all because of a single moment at a gas station, a decision to help someone when no one else would. As Jake walked home, he realized that kindness wasn't just a choice or a virtue. It was a force, one that could transform lives in ways that rippled far beyond the moment itself. And Jake was living proof of that.